The humid air of a Georgia July pressed against my skin like a heavy, wet blanket as I steered my silver 2012 Honda Civic onto the manicured gravel of the driveway. The engine made a rhythmic, metallic clatter that felt like a personal insult to the silence of this expensive neighborhood. Inside the cabin, the overwhelming scent of old, cracked leather and cheap vanilla air freshener filled my lungs. I adjusted my seat, feeling the jagged edge of a spring poking through the worn fabric of my jeans. Only 3 hours ago, I had been standing on the balcony of my $12 million penthouse in Manhattan, looking out at the skyline while a private chef prepared my breakfast. Now I was a world away, back in the stifling heat of the South, playing a role I had perfected over a decade of family gatherings. I looked down at my faded cotton shirt and generic trousers that I bought from a discount bin for $7.99. Every piece of my outfit was carefully chosen to reinforce the lie they all believed. To my mother and my sister, I was Kenzi, the struggling daughter, who barely kept her head above water as a secretary in the big city. They needed me to be the failure so they could feel like the stars. My real life as a senior managing partner at one of the most powerful venture capital firms on Wall Street remained a secret, buried deep beneath my humble layers. I checked the rearview mirror and smoothed my hair, preparing my face to look tired and apologetic. As I pulled closer to the sprawling white pillar villa that my mother had rented for Big Mama Lurlene's 80th birthday, I saw a familiar figure on the porch. Ms. Claudette was dressed in a silk caftan that probably cost more than my car's resale value. The moment she spotted my dented bumper, her face twisted into a look of pure disgust. She did not wave or smile. Instead, she marched down the stairs and gestured wildly for me to stop before I reached the front entrance. I rolled down the window and the wave of heat hit me like a physical blow. "Kenzi, do not you dare park that rusted bucket of bolts right there," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "We are about to take the official family portraits for my Facebook page and your sister's Instagram followers. If that eyesore is in the background, it will ruin the entire aesthetic of a perfect black family success story. Drive that thing all the way to the back of the property near the service entrance. Hide it behind the hedges where the caterers park. I want people to see excellence when they look at this house, not struggle." I nodded obediently, putting the car back into gear and feeling the familiar sting of her rejection. I walked through the service entrance and was immediately met with the heavy scent of seasoning salt and the chaotic heat of a kitchen in full swing. There was no hug from my mother or a warm welcome for the daughter who had traveled hundreds of miles to be here. Instead, Ms. Claudette pointed a sharp finger toward a massive pile of unwashed collard greens and a tray of raw ribs. "Since you arrived late and brought nothing of value, you can make yourself useful by finishing the soul food," she commanded without looking at me. I stripped off my light jacket and began the tedious task of cleaning the grit from the greens, my hands quickly becoming stained and pruned under the cold water. I looked like a hired servant in my own family home, but I kept my expression neutral, masking the sharp mind that was calculating market shares just hours before. The kitchen door swung open with a dramatic flourish, and Tiana strolled in, smelling of expensive French perfume and arrogance. She clutched a bright orange Birkin bag against her hip, as if it were a holy relic. "Be careful not to splash any of that grease on my leather, Kenzi," she chirped with a patronizing smile. "Darnell and I are heading to Paris for 2 weeks in the fall, and this bag needs to look pristine for the photos at the Eiffel Tower." I looked at the bag, noticing the slightly uneven stitching near the base that only an expert eye would catch. It was a high-quality imitation, a desperate attempt to maintain a status she could not actually afford. I simply nodded and continued scrubbing the greens, letting her bask in the glow of her own delusions. Darnell leaned against the granite countertop, crossing his arms and checking his gold Rolex with an air of immense self-importance. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and contempt. "So, Kenzi, how is the world of filing papers and answering phones treating you these days?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I heard that insurance premiums for those old clunkers like your Honda are going up. Do you even have enough in your little savings account to cover the monthly bill, or do we need to pass a hat around the party for you?" I looked up and caught the light reflecting off his watch. I watched the gold second hand closely. It did not sweep smoothly in the continuous motion of a true luxury timepiece. It ticked with a subtle, jerky hesitation. It was a cheap battery-operated movement hidden inside a counterfeit shell. I realized then that my entire family was living in a glass house built on credit and lies. I chose to stay silent, knowing that the higher they built their tower of cards, the harder it would eventually fall. The sun began to dip lower in the Georgia sky, casting long and jagged shadows across the patio where the guests had gathered. Ms. Claudette barked another order, telling me to stop hovering and start serving the expensive champagne that Darnell had supposedly purchased for the occasion. I balanced a heavy silver tray loaded with crystal flutes, my muscles steady despite the exhaustion creeping into my limbs. As I navigated through the crowd of laughing relatives, I felt a sharp and intentional pressure against my ankle. Tiana had stuck her designer heel out just far enough to catch my stride. I stumbled, the tray tilted dangerously, and a fountain of sparkling gold liquid poured directly onto her orange Birkin bag. The silence that followed was deafening. Tiana let out a shriek that pierced the humid afternoon air, clutching the dripping leather to her chest as if it were a wounded child. Before I could even mutter an apology, her hand whipped through the air and delivered a stinging slap across my left cheek. The force of the blow snapped my head to the side, and the copper taste of blood filled my mouth. "You clumsy, worthless girl!" she screamed, her face contorting with a rage that was far too intense for a simple accident. "Do you have any idea what you have done? This bag costs $15,000. That is more than your entire miserable annual salary as a secretary. You could work for a whole year and still not be able to afford a single strap of this leather." The guests gasped, and I could feel my mother's cold stare burning into the back of my neck. But I did not cry. I did not crumble. I slowly straightened my back, wiped a drop of champagne from my lip, and looked Tiana directly in her eyes. I leaned in close, so close that only she could hear my voice, which remained as calm and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. "Are you absolutely certain that this bag is worth $15,000? Tiana," I asked in a low whisper, because from where I am standing, the stitching on that bottom corner looks incredibly sloppy, and the hardware does not have the weight of genuine gold plating. A real artisan would never let a piece like that leave their workshop. Tiana froze, her eyes widening as the blood drained from her face. Her hand trembled against the damp leather. She looked down at the bag and then back at me, realization dawning on her that I knew exactly what she was hiding. Without saying another word, she pulled the bag behind her back and tucked it under her silk shawl. She stepped away from the center of the patio, her bravado vanishing in an instant as she hurried toward the house to hide the evidence of her fraud. I stood my ground, feeling the heat of the slap fade into a cold, hard determination. The game of shadows was reaching its end. The stinging heat on my cheek was nothing compared to the cold lump of dread forming in my chest as I retreated toward the house to find some ice. I took a detour through the back hallway, hoping to avoid any more of my mother's biting remarks. As I passed the heavy oak doors of the library, I heard the muffled but frantic voices of Miss Claudette and Tiana. I froze my back, pressing against the cool wallpaper as their conversation drifted through the thin gap in the doorframe. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. She is old and confused. Kenzi, she will not even know what she is signing. My mother whispered, her voice stripped of its usual southern charm and replaced with a predatory sharpness. "If we do not get her to sign that power of attorney tonight, the bank is going to come for Darnell. He owes over $50,000 to some very impatient people, and he used the family business as collateral." Tiana's voice followed, thin and desperate. "We have to do it, Mama. That house in Savannah is sitting on prime real estate. If we sell it now, we can clear the debt and still have enough left over to keep up appearances for the next year. It is just an old pile of bricks to her, but it is our survival." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I listened to them plot the theft of Big Mama Lurlene's only sanctuary. That house in Savannah was more than just bricks and mortar. It was the place where our ancestors had carved out a life from nothing. It was the place where I felt safe when my own mother made me feel like an outsider. My mind flashed back 15 years to the day I left for college. My mother had looked me in the eye, and told me there was no money for my education because Tiana needed a designer gown for her senior prom and a trip to the Bahamas. It was Big Mama who had sat me down in her kitchen, pressing a small velvet pouch into my hand. Inside were her meager savings from 20 years of working as a nurse's aide. "Use this for that laptop you need, baby," she had told me with a wink. "Your brain is your ticket to the world, and I am not letting them steal your future." She had sacrificed her comfort so I could have a chance at greatness, and now the two women who had never given me a dime were planning to render her homeless to cover for Darnell's greed. The pain of the past and the fury of the present merged into a singular burning purpose. They thought they were the masters of this game, but they had no idea that I had spent the last decade dismantling empires much larger than their petty lies. I pulled my phone from my pocket and sent a silent text message to my lead investigator in New York. I needed the full paper trail on Darnell's debts within the hour. If they wanted to play with fire in the house that Big Mama built, I was more than ready to let them get burned. The backyard was buzzing with the shallow laughter of people who valued status over substance. But the atmosphere shifted when a black Mercedes SUV pulled into the driveway. A man stepped out wearing a suit that cost at least $4,000, carrying himself with the predatory grace of a loan shark. This was Sterling, a notorious fixer in the local business circles, and someone I had crossed paths with during a high-stakes acquisition 2 years ago. As he walked towards the patio, his eyes scanned the crowd with practiced indifference until they landed on me. For a split second, his composure shattered, and his jaw dropped in pure disbelief. He recognized me instantly as the managing partner of Horizon Ventures, the woman who held the keys to the kingdom he desperately wanted to enter. Sterling began to march toward me, his hand extended and a sycophantic smile forming on his lips, ready to announce my true identity to the entire world. I did not move a muscle, but I fixed him with a cold, piercing stare that stopped him dead in his tracks. I gave a microscopic shake of my head, a silent command that carried the weight of a death sentence for his career if he disobeyed. He blinked, swallowed hard, and diverted his path toward Darnell instead. I retreated to the shadows of a large oak tree, picking up a glass of sweet tea and leaning against the rough bark. I watched with clinical interest as the predator prepared to feast on the scavenger. Sterling grabbed Darnell by the shoulder and led him toward a secluded corner of the garden, but their voices carried on the humid breeze. "I know you are drowning, Darnell." "Sterling," hissed his voice low but sharp, "I saw the internal audit report from your firm, and I know you have been skimming off the top to pay for this little weekend masquerade. You owe me $20,000 for that botched land deal, and I want it tonight." Darnell's face turned a sickly shade of gray, his eyes darting toward Tiana, who was busy taking selfies with a group of ants. "I do not have it right now, Sterling. I swear," Darnell pleaded, his voice cracking with a desperation that was pathetic to witness. "I just need another week to move some funds around." Sterling let out a cruel, mocking laugh that sounded like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "You do not have another week, you pathetic fraud," Sterling replied, poking a finger into Darnell's chest. "If you do not transfer that money by the time the sun goes down, I am going to walk over to your mother-in-law and tell her exactly how you are using her name to secure illegal loans. I am going to tell everyone here that your life is nothing but a mountain of debt and stolen dreams." I sipped my tea, the ice cubes clinking softly against the glass. It was a beautiful sight to see them turn on each other, two snakes biting at the same tail, while I held the power to crush them both with a single phone call. The evening air began to cool as the family gathered in the grand living room for the gift presentation. Tiana stepped forward first, her silk dress rustling as she handed Big Mama Lurleen a gold-embossed envelope with a theatrical flourish. "Happy birthday, Big Mama," she announced, making sure every guest could hear her clearly. "Darnell and I are sending you on a luxury cruise through the Mediterranean. 5 stars all the way." I knew the truth having seen the notification on Darnell's laptop earlier that the booking was pending and the credit card had been declined twice. It was a beautiful, empty promise wrapped in expensive paper. Big Mama smiled kindly, though her eyes remained observant and wise. Then it was my turn. I felt the collective judgment of the room as I approached with a small package wrapped in plain brown paper. I handed it to Big Mama, and she unwrapped it to find a weathered leather-bound journal that had belonged to my grandfather. It was filled with his handwritten notes about the land and family recipes. Ms. Claudette let out a sharp, mocking laugh that cut through the silence. "Are you serious, Kenzi?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension. "You brought your grandmother a dusty old book that has been sitting in a basement for decades. After all she did for you, this is the best you can do." She reached out, snatched the journal from Big Mama's lap, and tossed it onto a side table like it was a piece of trash. The journal fell open as it hit the table, and a crisp, white slip of paper fluttered out, landing face up on the carpet. Big Mama leaned forward, her aged fingers trembling as she picked it up. Her eyes widened behind her spectacles. It was a certified cashier's check, made out to her name for the amount of $100,000. The room went silent, as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the air. Ms. Claudette, seeing the numbers, but not understanding the source, lunged forward to grab the check. "Give me that scrap of paper, Lurleen," she barked, her greed overriding any sense of decorum. "Kenzi is probably playing a cruel joke or trying to hide some debt." Before her fingers could touch the ink, I reached out and caught my mother's wrist in a grip of pure steel. The suddenness of my movement startled her, and she froze. I did not raise my voice, but I spoke with the icy, commanding authority of a managing partner delivering a final ultimatum. "Put your hand down, Mother," I said, looking her directly in the eyes with a gaze that made her flinch. "That check is real, and it is a gift for Big Mama to ensure she never has to rely on your hollow generosity or Darnell's failing business ever again. You will not touch it, and you will not disrespect my grandfather's memory another time in my presence." For the first time in my life, the power in the room shifted entirely to me. The glass towers of Manhattan glittered under the harsh morning sun as Monday arrived with a sense of inevitable justice. Inside the headquarters of Horizon Ventures, the air was cool and smelled of expensive mahogany and success. Darnell walked through the lobby with a desperate kind of confidence, wearing his best charcoal suit and carrying a leather briefcase that he hoped would distract from the trembling in his hands. He had spent the entire night rehearsing a pitch to save his failing logistics company, convinced that he could charm the mysterious managing partner into granting him a $500,000 emergency loan. He believed he was walking into a meeting with a faceless tycoon who knew nothing of his weekend sins. My executive assistant led him to the top floor where the heavy double doors of my private office stood waiting. Darnell took a deep breath, straightened his silk tie, and stepped inside the room. I was sitting with my back to him, looking out at the panoramic view of the Hudson River from my high-backed leather chair. I heard his footsteps falter as he took in the sheer scale of the wealth surrounding him. "Good morning, Sir," Darnell began, his voice cracking slightly with unearned bravado. "I appreciate you taking the time to see me. My firm is facing a minor liquidity issue, but with the right infusion of capital, we are poised for massive growth by the fourth quarter." I slowly rotated my chair to face him. The moment our eyes met, the color drained from Darnell's face so quickly I thought he might faint. His briefcase slipped from his numb fingers and hit the plush carpet with a dull thud. His knees buckled, and he literally sank toward the floor, clutching the edge of a mahogany guest chair for support. "Kenzi," he gasped, his voice barely a whisper, as his brain struggled to reconcile the failed secretary from Georgia with the powerful woman sitting behind the desk of a multi-billion-dollar fund. I did not offer him a seat or a greeting. Instead, I picked up a thick blue folder and tossed it across the desk. It slid toward him, stopping right at his trembling fingertips. "Open it!" "Darnell," I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a jagged blade of ice. "It is a full forensic audit of your company accounts over the last 12 months. It shows exactly how you embezzled $40,000 from your employees' pension fund to pay for that Mercedes lease and the $20,000 rental for the villa last weekend. You did not come here for an investment. You came here because you are a criminal looking for a way to hide your theft. I am not your savior, Darnell. I am the woman who is about to oversee your total liquidation." The ink on the acquisition documents was still fresh as I sat in my quiet office staring at the digital deed to the Savannah property. I picked up my phone and dialed Ms. Claudette. Based on the GPS tracking from the family group chat, I knew she was currently standing in the hallway of Big Mama Lurleen's house, likely guiding a real estate agent through the rooms while Big Mama napped. When she answered, her voice was a sharp mixture of irritation and false sweetness. "Kenzi, why are you calling me at this hour?" she snapped. "I am very busy finalizing the paperwork to save this family from the ruin that Darnell caused. I do not have time for your little secretary dramas." I leaned back in my chair, my voice as smooth and cold as polished marble. "You can stop the tour, Mother," I said, watching the rain strike the window pane 50 floors above the street. "I am calling to inform you that the mortgage on the Savannah house is no longer held by the local bank. I purchased the entire debt through one of my holding companies 2 hours ago. Every brick, every blade of grass, and every memory in that house now belongs to me. You have no legal authority to sign a single contract or sell a single square inch of that land. You are trespassing on my private property." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line, followed by a sound that could only be described as a primal scream of fury. "You are a monster, Kenzi," she shrieked, her voice cracking with a desperate kind of hatred. "After everything I sacrificed to give you a life, you would steal from your own mother. You are an ungrateful, cold-hearted child who has forgotten the meaning of blood. You would let your sister and her husband end up on the street just to satisfy your own sick ego." I waited for the echoes of her rage to die down before I responded. My heartbeat did not even quicken as I delivered the final blow. "I have not forgotten anything, Mother. I remember every time you chose Tiana's lies over my truth. I am not stealing anything. I am simply taking out the trash and cleaning the house that you tried to auction off for a handful of silver. You and Tiana have 24 hours to pack your bags and leave." The morning sun began to burn through the Georgia mist as I pulled into the driveway of the Savannah estate one final time. I was not driving the rusted Honda Civic today. Instead, I sat behind the wheel of a midnight blue Rolls-Royce Ghost, its engine purring with a silent and lethal precision that matched my own heart. I stepped out of the car, my heels clicking against the pavement with a sound of absolute finality. On the front lawn, a mountain of designer suitcases, floral garment bags, and half-packed boxes lay scattered like the wreckage of a failed civilization. Tiana and Ms. Claudette stood in the center of the chaos, their faces puffy from a night of crying and their expensive silk robes stained with sweat. They looked small and defeated, stripped of the borrowed luxury that had been their only identity. I ignored their desperate pleas and the hollow apologies that fell from their lips like autumn leaves. I walked past them and into the house, finding Big Mama Lurleen sitting quietly on her favorite porch swing with a single small suitcase by her side. She looked at me and smiled, her eyes twinkling with the pride of a woman who had finally seen justice served. "Ready to go, baby?" she asked, her voice steady and warm. I took her hand and led her toward the Rolls-Royce, helping her into the buttery leather seat. As we backed out of the driveway, I caught a final glimpse of my mother and sister standing among their discarded possessions, two ghosts haunting a life that no longer belonged to them. I did not look back again. 2 days later, the humid heat of the South was a distant memory. I sat on the expansive glass balcony of my Manhattan penthouse, 60 stories above the bustling streets of New York City. The air up here was thin and cool, smelling of the clouds and the promise of a fresh start. Big Mama sat beside me in a plush velvet armchair, her spectacles perched on her nose as she looked out over the vast green rectangle of Central Park. The city lights were beginning to twinkle below us like a sea of fallen stars. She reached out and covered my hand with hers, her skin feeling like soft parchment and her grip surprisingly strong. "You did good, Kenzi," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion that I had waited 30 years to hear. "You kept your head down. You built your kingdom, and you never let their darkness extinguish your light." I felt a tear finally escape and roll down my cheek, but it was not a tear of sorrow. It was the warmth of her recognition, a silent benediction that finally healed the wounds of 1,000 insults. We sat there in the silence of the clouds, two women who had survived the storm and were finally free to enjoy the view. The most profound lesson from Kenzi's story is that true success is quiet, while failure is often loud. Darnell and Tiana spent their lives curating a desperate facade of wealth to hide their bankruptcy, proving that looking rich is vastly different from being rich. They underestimated Kenzi because she chose modesty over vanity, teaching us that we should never judge a person's capability by their appearance. More importantly, family ties are not a license for abuse. Success is the best revenge, but establishing firm boundaries is the ultimate form of self-love and radical preservation.